I think for me, I'm really speaking about a topic that I'm quite passionate about. And I think you will see as we continue, I'll be sharing some personal stories, some stories around the work that I've been doing or that I've been part of in trying to have more accessibility and inclusion. And just the outline of what we are going to talk about today, I'll probably I'll give a few definitions, which I think are important in the type of work that we are doing. I will share a bit more around just the South African context, where we are and how different we are from the rest of the world in terms of accessibility and how advanced we are in terms of, or basically how advanced other countries are in terms of designing for accessibility. And then I'll look at I'll look at the general theme around bias, which I think is a huge topic when it comes to the CX world that we are in. We need to be constantly mindful of our biases. And I will also have a few points which are, for me, a case that we need to build in terms of inclusion, why we should do it. And I will also share just some insights based on the work that I've been doing on how you can get started, because sometimes it can appear to be overwhelming and you just don't know where to start. So I'll share that, and in between I'll share a few stories around what I've experienced in my approach to things. Can move on to the next slide. Okay, so maybe a bit of introduction, which is an appropriate thing to do. So my name is Nthabeleng Mohapi, and I am a service designer at Nedbank. I work for the digital team at Nedbank, and I've been with Nedbank for quite some time, and my career has evolved from being in a call center environment to where I am today. And an interesting fact about me is that I'm a twin. So I've got a twin brother, and I also happen to be left-handed. So you guys might be probably wondering, why do I feel it's important to actually speak about the fact that I happen to be left-handed? Just to drive the story home, I'll probably share a story around my childhood. So my dad worked for Transnet all his life. And as a result, he would get transfers quite a lot at work, and he would have to move around the country quite a bit. So as a result, when I was in primary school alone, I think I went to 7 different primary schools. So I was always the new child in the school. And this one year, and I think maybe a bit of background, before moving to Durban, which is probably where I spent most of my childhood, I was actually going to schools that were teaching primarily in the Zulu language. So all my life, basically prior to me moving to Durban, the schools that I went to did all their training, so the teaching in the Zulu language. I then moved to Durban. When we moved to Durban, we then go to a multiracial school for the first time. And in this multiracial school, they had these desks that were joined to a chair. So you sort of like a chair and a desk built together, but it's designed for someone who's right-handed to be able to sit comfortably on it. So I'm not sure if you guys have seen those type of chairs where it actually has a desk on one side of it, and then it has a chair attached to it. And then if you are right-handed, you are able to actually sit and write. So being left-handed and being someone who struggles speaking English, I find myself in a school where all the desks were in the school were actually designed for people who were right-handed. And at that time, or prior to that time, I'd never considered being left-handed as a disadvantage. I'd always thought, in my family, my mom is also left-handed. My aunt is also left-handed because there's quite a lot of twins in the family. So there's a lot of people who are left-handed in my family. So I'd never thought it was a thing being left-handed, and I'd never considered it to be a disadvantage until I went to a school that had desks that were designed only for right-handed people. And at the time, obviously, because of the language barrier, I struggled communicating to the teachers that I wasn't able to write in their classrooms. And very often, I mean, if you are right-handed and if you are left-handed and you are trying to write on a desk that is designed for someone who's left-handed, you have to sit sideways in order for you to be able to write notes. So I would end up having to face the wall and look at the desk from my side, in order for me to be able to observe what the teacher was writing on the board. And that type of experience made me dislike the school that we had recently gotten into, even though it was probably the best school I'd attended thus far. Just because someone who was responsible for the furniture of the school had not considered a left-handed learner when they purchased the furniture, made the experience quite unpleasant for me. And those are some of the things that we don't often think about when we are designing. We often look at design, and we tend to have a bias towards people who are like us. And it's only after we encounter people who are different and have conversations with them that we become aware of our own biases and aware of the possible pain points that exist and how we can possibly overcome them. So that's probably the start of me being aware that there's a need for good design in almost everything, and that was basically back in primary school when I attended a school that actually had only right-handed desks for all the learners. We can move on to the next slide. I think with this kind of context in mind, it's important for us to be mindful of the why. And I think today, if there's anything that I do right, it would be to actually emphasize the why we should design we should be inclusive in our design. I want to touch on the definitions a bit, and I know that these definitions are often referenced in the workplace, where we need to have DEI in the workplace. But I do want us to be mindful of that, even in the way that we design for our different stakeholders. And diversity speaks to inclusion. So saying, do I feel represented in the group that exists in that space? So if you are in banking, our clients who are deaf feeling that they are represented in banking, are they represented in television, that are represented in all these different spaces? So diversity has a lot to do with representation. And equity has a lot to do with ensuring that you have fairness in the way that you treat people. So in the banking or the financial sector, there's a lot of legislation around treating clients fairly. So the theme of accessibility does somehow form part of that kind of forum. And I find that in that type of forum existing, it has made having conversations around accessibility much easier. And then the last bit being around inclusion, being around ensuring that you build a culture that basically makes people feel welcomed. So of the people that are represented in your design, how many of them feel welcome? So you might have a solution that solves for a specific client group, yet if the experience is unpleasant, it would make them feel unwelcome. And if you go back to the example that I gave around being in a school that had desks that were designed for right-handed people, I mean, I got the admission letter. I was told that I can be part of the school. I met the criteria to be a learner in that school, but having furniture that is designed for people who are not like me, and being excluded in the way that the furniture of the school was purchased, made me feel unwelcome. So it's not just about ensuring that you tick a box to say, hey, our solution caters for people who are living with disabilities. It's also about how do you make them feel in the process, and that is an important part of the way that we design. We move over and above meeting the minimum standards, and we ensure that we have a pleasant experience for people that we are designing for. If you can move on to the next slide for me. Okay, so I'd like to maybe pause here and give a bit of context around where we are as South Africa. And as someone who's been trying to get more advocacy around designing for people who are living with disabilities in the country, I then started looking at different topics and looking at different sources to try and get more insight about our legislation as a country, getting more insight around the different organizations that exist and so on. And one of the things that I came across, which is quite interesting, is that the South African Sign Language is actually not recognized as a language in South Africa as yet. So it was only up until this year that there were conversations and there was a signed document to say that it will be added on as an official language in the country. But at the moment, South African Sign Language is actually not recognized as an official language. So if you are catering for a client that is deaf and you are designing for them, there's actually no rule to say that their documents need to be translated in the language of their choice. As much as if you, for example, there's a legislation that says that if you are primarily Zulu speaking and you go into a financial institution and you apply for whatever product, they are basically obliged to ensure that they provide you with an explanation of what you are getting yourself into in your language. And at the moment, the clients who are deaf are not able to exercise that right, because South African Sign Language is not even recognized as a language, as an official language in our country, which is a huge barrier in terms of their access. And very often when you have conversations around South African Sign Language and clients or customers who are deaf, you end up having people say to you, but I mean, there's written content. You can put subtitles, and those are the minimum requirements that you can meet. That tick a box, but if you were to just think about yourself, when you watch TV, how often do you read subtitles to follow the conversation? And when you do read subtitles and switch off the sound, are you able to follow the conversation completely? Because very often in South Africa, the way that the subtitles are created, you're not even sure who is speaking at a specific time. So the accessibility and the experience in the different solutions that we have is not the best for a client who is living with a disability. So again, if you consider the fact that if you are deaf and your first language is South African Sign Language, having something written to you in English does not mean that you have been spoken to in your language of choice, because South African Sign Language is a language on its own and it's not English. So those are some of the obstacles that you encounter when you're trying to be mindful of the deaf community when you're designing. The second thing was around Braille in South Africa. So if you look around, probably in every ATM in South Africa, there's a requirement for you to have Braille in the numbers, so that you know what you are typing in when you are trying to withdraw money. There's a lot of like in the lifts in South Africa, there's Braille everywhere. But if you look at the fact that in South Africa, a lot of the deaf people actually are not able to read Braille. They're not able to understand Braille. So it is a minority of people in the country who are able to read Braille, and as a result, we might have been ticking a box in terms of accessibility by saying just add Braille. But if you have a conversation with someone who is deaf, you would find that it's not the most accessible option, and it's obviously something that is adapted from more advanced countries and does not necessarily reflect what a South African customer looks like. And the second thing about just having Braille everywhere is that, for example, one of the things that we discovered while we were having conversations with blind clients was that an ATM is a place where they feel most vulnerable. And for the longest of time, we've been trying to get the ATMs to be more accessible, to say, hey, how can we get someone feel comfortable and be able to withdraw money at an ATM? And meanwhile, the customer is saying, you know, if I am blind and you are trying to make the ATM safer or make it more accessible by adding braille to it, you haven't solved for the fact that I feel unsafe when I'm at the ATM because I'm not able to see who's behind me. I'm not able to see who's observing and looking at my PIN number as I'm typing. And those type of things are also contributors in the way that we should be considering and designing for people who are living with disabilities, looking beyond just ensuring that we meet the standards, but ensuring that we understand them deeply and we are able to offer them solutions that are most suitable for them. The third obstacle that you pick up around the South African context is really around data. We don't have a good understanding of how many clients are living with disabilities. At the moment, a lot of organizations don't ask you about your to declare your disability when you are being onboarded. So as a result, financial institutions, banks, and other organizations don't have a record of how many of their customers are living with disabilities. And because we don't know how many of these customers are living with disabilities, we're not able to cater for them, and we're not able to justify some of the decisions based on numbers. And I'll get into more details later on around what other options do you have to advocate for clients who are living with disabilities without necessarily focusing only on numbers. The last survey that we did or census that we had in the country that has a report on disability was based on the census in 2011. So you can see that it's been years, over a decade since we last had stats, and the stats at the time were excluding anyone who was under the age of 5 at the time. So if someone was born with a disability and they are under the age of 5, they're not part of the 2.9 million that has been accounted for in the country. They didn't consider anyone who was staying in a home, for example. So if you are in an institution, and we all know that most customers or most people who are living with disabilities from time to time end up having to get some sort of assistance in terms of caregivers, and very often we rely on having different NGOs that cater for these for the needs of these customers or the people of these people, and as a result, people who are in NGOs, in any type of home, were not actually accounted for during the time of the census. So there's a huge concentration of people that are living with disabilities that were not catered for. And then there are other disabilities that are not so obvious, and as a result, people would not declare them. So things like being partially, like visually impaired partially, or temporarily disabled because of some injury, and whatever the case is. So those type of disabilities were not accounted for, and in South Africa, in our census, there's actually no data around mental illnesses. So in terms of that type of disability, it's not accounted for in terms of our census, and as a result, you can see that there's a huge gap in the data that we have, and this gives you an idea that a lot of there's far greater numbers of people who are living with disabilities than what we have in our data. If you look at the fact that as people get older, they are more prone to disabilities, and they become more vulnerable. Those cases are not documented as well. So you can see that if you were to just look at the numbers that we have and the numbers that are communicated in terms of people who are living with disabilities, they are far less than what they really are. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so maybe I'll share a personal story. So somewhere during lockdown, my mom is a nurse, and so she had been trying to get a specific qualification in order for her to be competent in a different type of work that she was doing. So it was more specialized type of work, and she needed to have a board exam written via the South African Nursing Council. So my mom was involved in a car accident when she was about 20, and she was hurt on her right hand. So she originally writes with her right hand, but because of the accident and that left her thumb, she was not mobile, which means she was not able to hold a pen with her right thumb. She had to teach herself to write with her left hand. So she's now trying to write this exam, and she's failed the exam 3 times. So for me, it didn't make sense because it was something that my mom had already been doing. She's already a nurse. She's already been doing the work that is required of her. It's just a matter of her getting the accreditation. So I asked her, is it stress related? Why is it that she's not able to pass this exam? She responds with, it's because it's a lot of writing. It's more theory than other types of tests that I've done previously. And she says to me, I never finish any of my exams. I always look at the paper and go for the topics I'm most confident in, because it takes me long to write my answers compared to everyone else, because I'm writing with a hand that I'm not used to. So for me, this is a shock. I have known my mom all my life, and she's been using her left hand to write all my life. And I had never considered the fact that she never finishes any of her exams, and she always chooses topics to write, because she's not as quick as everyone else that's been given 2 hours to complete a paper. And obviously, I am like so heartbroken by the story. I then write to the nursing council. I asked them what's the process to follow, because I'd like to request a special exam for my mother. I get a lot of to and forth, and then eventually I'm actually told that I need to apply for the special exam via the school that my mom was registered in back in KZN. So I go to the school that my mom was registered with, and they tell me that, we don't do that in the school. The best we can do is we can try and get maybe an extra hour for her to write, but that's the best we can do. And by then I'm like, how does an extra hour help? Because if someone has been writing for 4 hours and they are writing with a hand that they're not used to writing with, by the time they get to the 5th hour, they're exhausted and they're not going to be able to complete the exam on time. Is there another way? Basically, we end up having about like 6 steps and having to escalate and pull rank and get the health department involved. And only then my mom is able to get this video interview for her to be able to write, to be interviewed and do the exam. And for me, it's like it's a very difficult process for someone who's living with disability. So we're saying that we are designing experiences, and we are saying that we are offering opportunities to grow in the nursing space only for people who are able to write like everyone else. And for me, it was like an eye opener on just how systems in this country are designed for people who are abled, and may not be a case of us intentionally saying that we're excluding them, but because of the biases that we exclude them by virtue of having a more difficult process for them to follow when they are trying to get the basics of things like education. You can move on to the next slide for me, please. So I think I've touched on this a bit, just to ensure that as a designer, you have the responsibility to be aware of your own biases. You need to know that as long as you're not exposed to something, you'll probably be inclined towards a certain way of thinking. And you need to ensure that you overcome your biases by exposing yourself to people who are differently abled. So have more conversations with people who don't think like you, people who don't do things like you do. And by doing that, you are opening yourself up, and you're ensuring that you are stripped of your biases. And for me, had I not been exposed to my mom, who is someone that I live with, had I not had the conversation with her and experienced this journey with her, I probably wouldn't have looked at the education system in this country in the same way. I probably wouldn't have looked at the way that things are constantly designed for people who are abled. You can move on to the next slide for me. Okay, so I want to maybe propose that we look at why we should have inclusive ways of doing work, inclusive way of designing for people. In other countries like the UK, you get like the British, for example, the British Standard Institute actually has law that stipulate that it is illegal for you to have designs that are not accessible. So the BS H300 actually stipulates the way that buildings should be designed for people who are in wheelchairs. So it has a breakdown of what guidelines you can follow as someone who's maybe constructing a building. What are some of the criteria you need to meet in order for you to be able to meet the requirements and ensure that when you're building a building, it is accessible. So that type of legislation does not exist in our country. We don't have specific legislation that basically states that if you don't have accessible designs, you can be penalized. You can be there's no, like, it's not a criminal offense for you to design something that is not accessible, and as a result, we can't really build a case based on the legal case for doing things. You can't say, let's do this because we need to comply, because there's no legislation that speaks to accessibility. I mean, the closest thing that we have to a legislation that speaks to accessibility in the country is our constitution, but we all know that it's quite broad. And as a result, it's not easy for us to be able to criminalize people who are not designing for accessibility. So the legal case in this country it's not easy for us to prove that we should do, or we should have inclusive design, simply because it's something that we need to comply to as organizations or as individuals. There is the South African Schools Act that has a bit of legislation. Yes, you are quite correct, Peter. There is also the South African Schools Act that speaks about, there's a bit of legislation around the ensuring that there's accessibility and in terms of the way things are done at schools, but it doesn't speak to everything more broadly. So there is basically a need for us to actually advance in terms of our legislation as a country, and have more guidelines as a country that speak to design across different types of disabilities. We have different organizations that provide guidelines specific to the type of disability that they specialize in. For example, the Deaf SA would have something around clients who are deaf, but we don't necessarily have something that sits and focuses on accessibility across the different types of abilities as a country. And I think as designers, we have an opportunity here to consider this and design for something like this, because it doesn't exist at the moment. There's also a business case. We need to consider the fact that, I mean, there's proven stats that if you are more inclusive in design and inclusive in the way that you actually hire people in your organization, you are able to have more innovative solutions. It is more profitable for the company, but those benefits are often long term, and it's not easy for you to advocate for them just based on that alone. What I want us to be mindful of is that it is actually probably best to advocate for this from a moral case. Do it simply because it's the right thing to do. Do it because you are mindful of the people that are part of our community. We are mindful of the different able people that we have among us, and therefore we have a moral duty to actually do the right thing and design with them in mind. Okay. So if we move on to the next thing around getting started, what can you do as a designer to ensure that you are you design with accessibility in mind? I think probably the first thing that you can do is you can upskill yourself, ensure that you expose yourself as much as possible. There's quite a lot of podcasts that speak around accessibility. There's a lot of content that you can find on I think the Apple app developer has quite a lot of content that speaks about accessibility that you can tap into. You can do courses like in the Interaction Design Foundation. There's actually one that speaks about designing for accessibility. So you can actually go and study and ensure that you upskill yourself as a designer in order for you to be more knowledgeable on the topic, because I find that the more knowledgeable you are in the topic, the more you are able to contribute in the different teams that you form part of, or the different organizations that you're part of. The second thing that I would want to say, how do you get started, is maybe by ensuring that you are part of different conversations, and very often conversations around accessibility are quite uncomfortable. So for me, one of the examples is that one of my friends is a South African sign language interpreter, and whenever I met up with her, and she had a friend who was deaf, I would speak to her deaf friend and not look at them and look at her as someone who's an interpreter. And what she then called me to the side and said, you know what, Tabs, that's not how you do things. When you speak to somebody, you look at them and have conversations with them. Don't look at the interpreter. And for me, that was like mannerisms around people who are deaf that I wasn't aware of. And having exposure and having conversations to people who are different from you will basically allow you to actually have more understanding. And something as simple as just having a conversation with somebody who's deaf, or someone who's blind, and asking them conversations and just engaging with them in terms of their pain points, what they find easy, what their lives look like. You'll be shocked at the number of just rich insight that exists just around the different people that you can have conversations with. Tell stories. So for me, I feel like one of the reasons why CX is a powerful way of sharing information is because in the CX world, you are able to be a storyteller. You are able to advocate for people who are living with disabilities. You're able to amplify their voices. Once you've heard their stories, once you've understood what they're experiencing, you can actually ensure that you go to the right platforms and allow for rich and meaningful conversations to happen around how do we make life easier for them, around how do we design better for them, and even better, how do you design with them? So tell more stories. Every time you hear something, ensure that you amplify those voices and share what you have. Move on to the next slide. I'm just going to share things that are probably a bit more practical around the different tools that you can use that exist in the CX world, and how you can actually ensure that you are more inclusive in your design. So for me, I feel like at the planning stage of each project that you are in, so I'm not sure how you start out your plans, but in most cases, if you're going to be doing some service design work, you probably start by mapping out your stakeholders. So I would say when you're at the stage when you are actually mapping your stakeholders, you need to include clients who are living with disabilities at the beginning of the project, and design with them in mind, as opposed to probably consider them later on in the process, when someone is asking you, hey, did you consider someone who's deaf when you were designing this, or did you consider someone who's in a wheelchair when you were designing this? Rather, consider them and include them as part of your stakeholder maps at the very beginning of your project. The second option is for me is maybe at the stage when you are doing the empathy. I'm not sure which process you follow in terms of your design thinking, whether it's design think or you're doing the double diamond of human-centered design, whatever methodology that you are approaching. ensure that at the empathy stage or the research stage or the discovery stage of your journey, make sure that you are mindful of different types of people and differently abled people. So have personas that basically are based on research that you have done for clients who are living with disabilities. So if you're doing a project, don't wait for a project that specializes on clients who are living with disabilities. So probably a learning for me is that for the longest of time, because I was so passionate about this, I kept knocking in different doors in our organization and trying to find a team that was willing to take on a project and fund a project that focuses on clients who are living with disabilities. And I found that it was quite difficult to do that. But the moment I got into a project and I then considered clients who are living with disabilities as part of my everyday work, it was easy for me to advocate for clients who are living with disabilities. So if I was doing a branch, a rollout project, instead of having to focus on a separate project that speaks to clients who are living with disabilities, I then said, okay, we're rolling out to new branches. Can we consider the fact that we have clients that are in wheelchairs, we have clients that are blind, we have or visually impaired, we have clients that are deaf. How do we service them better in a branch environment? So it's part of my day-to-day work, and I ensure that I bring up conversations around inclusion in every project that I'm in. It's also important to ensure that when you are ideating, that you consider clients who are living with disabilities. Don't just focus on getting ideas from clients who are like you. So, and this also speaks to even the way that you recruit your participants. It speaks to the way that you even recruit internal staff members. So if you're in a position to actually hire someone to work and be part of your team, ensure that you are mindful of different abilities. For example, in our team, we have a colleague that is blind, and having a colleague that is blind has made it easier and has empowered us a lot as a team in terms of how accessible our products are, because at every stage they're able to share with us and give feedback to us as we continue with the work. And this is something that we would never had thought about or even done had we not had a staff member in our team who is blind. And then probably the last bit would be if you have an opportunity, audit the experiences that you have in your organization. Look at the different touch points and look at how accessible each touch point is. And I think probably this is something that you can do when there's a bit more design maturity in the team, where you are able to do experience teardowns and go back to the work that you've already rolled out, and seeing how you can iterate and improve that work by ensuring that when you are iterating and you are having maybe your MVP2 of the project, you are basically considering accessibility as part of those existing projects. So don't think that you're going to keep it for new projects only. Rather build it on to even existing projects. When you have an opportunity to improve something, ensure that you have conversations around accessibility as well. Okay, move on to the next one. Okay, I think this is my last slide. I think a few months ago, because I'm now constantly mindful of accessibility, there are certain things that I look out for. And at the moment, I enjoy having coffee at Nthabeleng Coffee, because I find that their shop is more accessible. So if you are in a wheelchair, you'd find that in most coffee shops there is a culture of having bar stools, and basically the sitting areas are quite high. And I actually don't mind having bar stools in the shop. I think Nthabeleng Coffee also has bar stools, but what I like is that the area where you mix your coffee and where you probably put in your sugar and close your lid, that particular area is actually at counter level where someone in a wheelchair can access. So having that, and I think it's probably the only company coffee brand that I've seen that actually has the counter where you mix where you're stirring your coffee. It's actually at counter level where someone in a wheelchair can easily access, be able to throw things in the bin. Even their bin is quite accessible, and it just makes the experience way better. And it's not something that is different for someone who is not in a wheelchair. They can all be part of the same experience, and someone in a wheelchair can end up not feeling like they're disadvantaged because they are in a wheelchair. So I quite like that experience at Motherland Coffee. And I'm not sure if it's all the Motherland Coffees, but it's the one that's in Pine Slopes. That's the one that I paid attention to, and it was such a great experience being there. The second one was the Nedbank NB chatbot. So it has a screen reader. So for a client who is visually impaired or blind, they're able to navigate the app using the NB chatbot. So for me, I thought this is quite a great thing in terms of disability, because very often clients who are living with disabilities have to basically rely on separate screen readers for them to navigate their applications. And in most cases, it's basically a touch, where they have to go and touch different parts of the screen and be able to hear what where they are touching. Whereas with the NB chatbot, they basically click on the chat option, and they ask a question, and it automatically types for them, and then it helps them and becomes like a wayfinder of some sort for them to actually know where in the app they are. And if at some stage they are struggling and the app is not able to they're not able to actually navigate the app successfully with the chatbot, it then hands them over to a consultant in the contact center, and they take over the conversation, and they continue to chat with the customer, where the customer is basically saying what they need, and it's automatically typing for the consultant in the call center to be able to assist the customer. So for me, this was probably one of the great examples of an accessible product that we worked on at Nedbank, and that I'm quite proud of. So if you can check it out and ensure that you give us feedback when you do. And then the last thing was probably the South African Sign Language interpreter. Every government intervention that we had, especially during lockdown, I think I was particularly proud of the fact that there was always an interpreter, especially because it was during COVID, a very anxious time as a country, where people who are living with disabilities were often excluded from conversations, and they were not necessarily sure what was happening, and just experiencing that level of anxiety and having someone address you in your language and tell you what is happening made it so much better. And I think that was it's a great example of how the government always ensures that they do that particular thing right, in terms of having sign language interpreters every time there's an address for the nation. So this is something probably not just even pre-COVID, it was something that was constantly seen, even in the news in South Africa. I mean, there's other concerns around how visible the interpreters are, or how we screen the interpreters, but that's obviously a story for another day. But I must say that I'm quite impressed with the fact that they consistently cater for customers who are living with disabilities, and specifically deaf clients when communication is going out. Okay, I think that's the end. Taking questions. How much time do we have? Okay, we have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Nthabeleng. If anybody's open to asking questions, feel free. There's no need to be shy. Maybe any comments or feedback from the audience?
Hi, everyone. If I may ask a question to the speaker, is it possible for us to reach out to you off the call to continue the conversation?
Definitely. You can definitely reach out to me. I am on LinkedIn, so you can reach out to me, Nthabeleng Mohapi on LinkedIn. You can also reach out to me on the Interaction Design Foundation profile. So that's yeah, I'm part of Interaction Design Foundation, so you can reach out to me there as well.
Yeah, if anybody needs to find Nthabeleng on LinkedIn, it's Nthabeleng Mohapi, Mohapi. Do you have any comments? Maybe does anybody want to share about their experiences or challenges if living with any kind of disability or impairment?
So I just want to extend on what I said. Actually, I am a person with a disability, so if possible, could you post that the LinkedIn page in the chat? Because I obviously can't see. I think a few of you guys might know me by now, but a lot of what you said is quite true in terms of experience for a lot of people with disabilities. Though, as somebody in the chat mentioned, we do have similar legislation, and the Concord a few weeks ago did declare that there is a bit of a push towards making accessibility more serious and more of a matter. So I think it's perhaps about implementation and enforcement in our country, not so much about legislation.
No, thank you so much for that, Venetian. I think you're quite right. We have definitely a long way to go in terms of how do we implement that. And if you want to have conversations outside this forum, I'm happy that we engage and continue the conversation.
Sorry, it's Peter speaking. So maybe just a bit of clarity on the comment I made. So yeah, the 10400 is quite new. Before that, we had the 0400, and Part S has been around for quite some time, but it was never really enforced very strictly by councils. There has been a big move to drive inclusion in publicly accessible buildings in terms of Part S. Part S has also been rewritten recently. There's also quite a substantial amount of information in Part T, which deals with fire, just to make buildings safe and to allow for buildings even to have safe areas in case buildings are there's a fire in a building, that there's safe areas where people can stop and wait for a firefighter to help them exit the building, or to there must be visual and audio alarms. There must be, yeah, so there's quite a big drive from the built environment to drive inclusion, especially in public buildings. But you're absolutely right. It's nowhere near, you know, most of the buildings we deal with are existing. And therefore, unfortunately, because the plans have already been approved, they don't necessarily have to comply now. However, when the moment we try and make changes to these buildings, we luckily then have to comply with these various regulations in order to get approval. But yeah, like I said, you're absolutely right. To try and get client buy-in sometimes is a bit of a problem, because they sometimes don't want to have that conversation. You know, it's sort of an afterthought. You know, spaces are put in the back just to kind of comply instead of actually thinking and empathizing with the people who will use these spaces and needs to use these spaces. And yeah, so there's definitely more to be done, yeah, to get the conversation going.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that comment, Peter. And I think let's also have this conversation offline, because I think the buildings are an area that I haven't been working on actively. I am in banking, and there's definitely a need to have a more collaborative approach to this and consider different sectors when designing.
Perfect. I've already sent you an invite on LinkedIn. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I throw another question out there? How do we sell the business case to consider accessibility as or accessible design, to executives and to essentially our business partners?
I think for me, what I tend to do is I basically include people who are differently abled in the research phase of the journey. So when you and not just going and do the research separately and then going back to them and presenting the findings, but rather getting them along in the journey. So if you're going to interview customers that are differently abled and you have them as part of your project, it's always a good idea to have your stakeholders as observers in the interview. In that way, they're able to get firsthand what customers are actually saying. And I find that in most cases, verbatim from customers does go a long way in driving engagement from stakeholders. It's not easy. Not every stakeholder is the same. Not every stakeholder responds in the same way. But I do say that a good start would definitely be to involve them and engage them in the experience and getting first-hand experience from customers. If you're ideating for like you're doing a service prototype. For example, you're working in a branch and we're doing service prototypes. I'll have product owners come in and observe customers who are definitely able to trying to get into the branch. In that way, you are able to get them to empathize with the customer they're designing a bit more. And when they're empathizing with the customer, then it changes the way that they look at how they implement decisions and how the people who are differently abled are the ones who are affected by the decisions that are being made, and also having a diverse team. So if you are in a consultancy space, hire people who are differently abled, and let them be part of conversations when decisions are being made.
Nthabi saying hi, it's Michelle in here. I wanted to ask, because of the advancements in the technology, and I suppose we speak a lot about like the physical client experience around like people with disabilities, but in like the world of technology, a lot of those challenges like fall away. Like if you look at just the service industry, like there's chatbots now, there's like the metaverse, there's social media, there's still like call centers and, like all those kind of service channels now. Do you feel that the challenges have kind of like diminished in that space because of technology? So when it comes to like the voice of the customer, you kind of like dealing with just customers and you don't really distinguish between like a disabled customer and just a normal customer, because I suppose in like a bank environment to like a post office environment, you can see the customers, so you're aware of their challenges. But in the technology space, a lot of the times we don't deal directly with the customer in that way.
Sorry to interrupt, but could I help the answer there, Mike?
Okay.
Speaking as a technologist, I can tell you the majority of the internet is actually not accessible to screen reader users. I think the W3 Foundation came out with a paper, I think it was last year or the year before, mentioning that somewhere north of 70% of the internet is not accessible, and an additional 20% has some accessibility, and the rest is actually accessible. And that's, we're talking here, internet being everything from applications on devices due to websites and so forth. So unfortunately, even though technology has moved forward, people with disabilities, and I'm including here things like the metaverse, has not been considered at all.
Yeah.
And
So you're
even in the metaverse, with your for deaf and such, will also struggle extremely. So the old technology is unfortunately more accessible at this point in time.
So there's definitely you're quite right. You're spot on, and I'm happy that you're sharing in from your personal experience as well. So what we are picking up is that with the advancement of technology, it is posing different types of problems, and you're finding that clients who are visually impaired and clients who are blind are actually having worse experiences digitally. So for a client who was probably who's a motor disability, and they're not able to get into a branch, and they now have an app, so that experience becomes better for them because they now can bank from the comfort of their home. But for a client who was who's blind, it means that they move away from having someone that they knew personally assist them at the branch to having to deal with an app that might not be accessible, and might not give them the level of confidence that they have when they're speaking to a staff member that they know personally from their home branch. So there's different types of complexity that comes with digital, and I don't think that it's easier for all customers. I think there's definitely a need for us to be more inclusive, and there are standards that exist, like your AA, your AAA standards that speak to how do we write code for clients who are living with disabilities, how do you consider the color, the contrast, and all of those things for clients who are visually impaired. But having those alone is not enough. We still have to test the experience based on actual users who are living with disabilities, and based on a lot of tests that are happening. Well, first of all, in a lot of companies, the tests are not happening. So they test with abled customers and assume that the experience is the same for clients who are living with disabilities. And when they do test, and not a lot of them are actually accessible for clients who are living with disabilities. So we do have a huge challenge. Okay, I think we are way over our time. So if you want to continue with the conversation, please reach out on LinkedIn. I must thank you all for joining in today and for having this conversation with us. I'm going to hand over to Shez to maybe share where to from here.
No, we don't have to worry with too many formalities. I think thank you so much for having this session. I was really looking forward to it, and you really shared so much information with us. And I think sometimes, especially when we're too focused on the digital side of things, we completely forget how we're lacking and how in creating a better space in the physical sense. So thank you very much for everything you've shared this evening. And yeah, thank you everybody for making time to join us. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Nthabeleng. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.